Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's important conversation titled Empowering Migrant Mothers, Providing Critical Education Pathways for Young Children. We are so glad you're here with us. My name is Dr. Asia Foster, and I am the Regional Vice President for North America and the Caribbean for the World Organization for Early Childhood Education, or OMEP, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator. Today's session will focus on empowering migrant mothers and improving educational pathways for young children affected by displacement. As we reflect on the ongoing efforts to advance the commitments outlined in the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, we recognize the importance of strengthening community networks, supporting caregivers, and ensuring safe, nurturing environments for children on the move. These areas of focus are also deeply connected to the critical areas of education and training of women and the girl child. Our speakers will discuss the unique challenges faced by marginalized women and children, particularly in the context of forced migration, while exploring strategies to promote mental health, social emotional learning, and educational equity. We are incredibly fortunate to have an amazing lineup of speakers with us today, each bringing a unique expertise and perspective to this conversation. As we listen, I would encourage you to reflect on the role that safe, nurturing environments and strong community networks play in supporting families on the move. Please note that we will reserve all of our questions for our dedicated Q&A time, but we do encourage you to add your questions to the Zoom chat, or if you're joining us through the Whova platform, that you can add your questions to the Q&A section on that platform throughout the session. So as things become top of mind in the discussion or you have burning questions, please feel free to put them there and we will come back at the end and try to address as many of those as possible. We've also made sure that there is dedicated time during the end of this session for community discussion, where you'll have an opportunity to exchange ideas and share resources pertinent to the topic. We know that many of you are working in spaces that are of particular interest and focused for this population that we'll be talking about today. And we'd love to be able to hear more about the work that you're doing. So with that, let's get started. Our first speaker is Julie Casper, who brings extensive experience in supporting educators working with refugee and migrant children. Julie is the former director of Teacher Learning and Leadership for Childhood Education International's Center for Professional Learning. She served as refugee school coordinator for Tucson from 2014 to 2018 and joined the Center for Professional Learning in the summer of 2018 to lead the Refugee Educator Academy initiative. Julie's research interests include educational equity, transformative, sustaining, and liberatory pedagogies, teacher, student, parent, and community leadership and education, and teacher professional development and well-being. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Estia. Thank you, everyone, for being here. What a delight it is to be here on this special occasion with such a distinguished audience as we talk about the work of the UN's Commission on the Status of Women and what we can contribute to efforts ongoing around the world in what to me feels like a very urgent crisis that we're all facing in our careers, in our work, in our communities. I'm joining you from Tucson, Arizona, very close to the border with Mexico. So migration is part of my life, part of my upbringing. This is the land of the O'odham and Yaqui peoples. And so I want to acknowledge their presence in this space with us today. I'm going to share my screen. So give me a moment to bring that into slideshow. All right. So I'm here today speaking as an independent researcher, as a PhD candidate, soon to graduate, very excited about that, and as a longtime educator and education leader, as Asia said. The views expressed are my own, and they draw upon a diverse and rapidly growing body of evidence. I do want to share also the organization that I had the great pleasure of working with for a number of years, CE International, Childhood Education International, which is focused on building bright futures for every child worldwide. And I'd like to invite you to take advantage of a couple of opportunities, open educational resources that are available. Please grab the QR code if you like, and I'll drop links in the chat later. But these are resources that are helpful for educators from early childhood through higher education, and that can also be helpful for communities and nonprofit programs. I also want to invite you to join Childhood Education International's online community, where practitioners can meet with each other and dialogue about important topics. And we have a number of wonderful early childhood educators who are bringing questions and resources to this space and would love to engage in conversation with you. So please do join if you're interested and if you're able. My colleagues on this panel, I'm so honored to be part of this panel. So thank you again, Asiya and Elizabeth, for the invitation. Thank you, Kate and Dina, for offering space to be in dialogue with you today. My colleagues will be sharing some specific interventions and research from their work on migration, parenting, caregiving, and early childhood development. My hope is to set the stage for the discussion to follow by sharing some insights from the literature, starting with a look at a model that illustrates the impact of parental migration on the psychosocial well-being of children left behind by parents who are moving from rural to urban China. This research has been ongoing for quite a long time and is quite robust, but I pulled this graphic specifically from a 2018 article by Chengyu Zhao and their colleagues. And I pulled this because of the dynamic interaction between these pieces that I want to draw attention to. What they are showing in this graphic is that there is a dynamic play between psychosocial well-being for children as related to parental migration. And this includes factors like time or the duration of absence or separation. It includes factors like finances and the stability of the home situation with extended family caregivers. It includes factors around the relationship between the children and their migrant parents, and the emotional impact these diverse and interacting factors have on all of the actors, the parents, the children, the extended family caregivers, the communities. So this is to draw our attention to what we're going to be talking about in this conversation together. And while the financial resources are vital in migrant families, as they ensure for children's basic needs, such as food and shelter, etc., the separation from parents can be challenging, even when in the loving home of extended family. This piece of research is from 2023. It's a study by Hazer and Gerderbach, and it's focused on Syrian displacement and the impact of this displacement and the often multiple moves along a complex migration journey, as depicted via the map on the left, the impact of these moves on families and children. I draw attention to this study because it focuses on the pre-migration traumas as well as the post-migration traumas that families and children may endure. These include acculturation trauma, they include displacement trauma and war trauma. And specifically, I want us to look at the impact of this trauma on infants and young children as we start this conversation today. These researchers note that cumulative trauma, as experienced by many Syrian families and children, leads to negative development outcomes for children, including decreases in cognitive functioning, emotion regulation, affective processing, and prospective control, or the ability to anticipate, plan, and prepare for future events. The linkages between displacement, migration, and trauma are well documented, and the findings from this subset of literature resonate with findings from a much broader set of literature on childhood trauma in general and its impacts. I draw our attention here to some work by Child Trends, a US-based research organization focused on improving the lives of children, youth, and families. This graphic shows the many adverse effects of trauma on child development, including around cognition, physical health, emotions, relationships, mental health, behavior, and brain development. Having just looked at the previous slide, you'll notice that there are connections, obviously, right, between what migrant families face as they face trauma on their journeys, their migration journeys, and what the literature tells us in general about childhood trauma. As a former educator, when I look at this and I think about the children who are entering my classroom or my learning center or a community space, I think about the challenges both that the child is facing in that space, that shared space, but also that their peers, their parents and caregivers, and the educators themselves are facing in managing all of the needs and building upon all of the assets and talents of the children in the room. A recent study from 2024 by Daga and others explores each of the dimensions mentioned before in an effort to understand both the challenges and the opportunities for migration and for migrants in early childhood. Specifically, they're looking at migration flows in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they note that parental migration has mixed effects on children left behind due to the potentially positive impact of increased financial resources for the family and for the children. But they also note that there can be potentially negative impacts resulting from the absence of parents, which they find correlates to children's emotional and cognitive development. For children on the move or those who migrate, these authors find evidence of negative impacts on cognitive and social emotional development, among other areas that were discussed in the previous graphic. But what to do about this? So despite the challenges and the alarming evidence coming out of the early childhood development and education and emergency sector, there is hope. We know that protective factors are very, very important in the life of a young child, and that when these protective factors are in place, these children can thrive despite all of the many challenges their families are facing. Consensus among researchers and practitioners in the early childhood development literature for both migrant and non-migrant children is that there are protective factors that support healthy child development. This graphic is from the Friends National Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention, and it's not specific to migration settings, but it offers key factors that the literature shows should be considered in migration context and with migrant parents as well. Again, as an educator, I ask myself questions like, how am I ensuring that parents have social connections, that they have concrete, including financial supports, that they have strategies for stress management and resilience, and knowledge of child development, including social and emotional development? And how are they able to build nurturing relationships and strong attachments with their children during times of displacement and migration? I ask these same questions of teachers and school leaders, because as adults in these children's lives, it's important that they too have all of these resources internally and externally to provide protection and well-being for the children in their lives. If living in another city, having left children behind, what is needed to ensure that every child has positive attachments to loving adults and maintains a meaningful relationship with their parent or parents, if possible? What are the mechanisms within migration corridors, war zones, and displacement settings for ensuring that every childhood space, be it a home, a community center, an early childhood learning space, or a school, is attending to these protective factors? This illustration, I'm sorry, it's a bit fuzzy. I couldn't find a better example, but this illustration is focused more specifically on humanitarian contexts, including migration settings. And it points to many of the same protective factors we saw in the previous graphic, as well as to some unique aspects of child protection and family strengthening in emergency, displacement, and migration settings. Most significantly, perhaps, is the focus on safety, dignity, and rights, including through child protection, participation, and keeping the interests of the child front and center in all programming and supports for families and communities. When we attend to these factors, mothers and children, any adult caregivers and the children in their care can thrive. There is a rich and growing body of literature, including as will be shared by my colleagues momentarily, that helps us understand what is needed for both children and caregivers, including mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts, teachers, neighbors, and many important people in the community and in the circle of every child. to create a sense of safety and well-being for young children, even in very difficult times and circumstances. It takes a village, as the saying goes, and this is the point I wish to end with as we consider the ways we are contributing to creating positive, enabling environments for caregivers so that they can protect and care for their children. It is vital that young children build strong, positive attachments to adults they trust and love and who love them. We celebrate mothers, all caregivers around the world that do all that they can, including in the toughest circumstances, to provide for their children and to ensure their children have safe, nurturing spaces in which to grow up. Our job, I believe, as educators or social workers or psychologists, humanitarian workers, and other support workers and advocates is to ensure that these enabling conditions for parents and caregivers are in place and they are sustained, even and most especially in conflict, displacement, migration, and emergency settings, so as to minimize the potential negative effects of migration on early childhood development, and so as to maximize the safety, protection, care, and love that every child receives. If you'd like to connect with Childhood Education International's community of practitioners to continue the conversation, please join the online hub. And you can reach out to me via my email, which I'll drop in the chat, along with some article links after I finish speaking. Thank you for your time, for your attention. I want to pass the mic back to Asia, and I can't wait to hear from my co-panelists and then open discussion with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julie, for all of the reminders, but especially around how migration-related trauma affects both children and caregivers, and emphasizing the importance of emotional resilience and strategies, as well as how community networks serve as a vital source of stability and connection when we're talking about displaced children and families. So thank you. Next, we'll move on to our next speaker. Next, we have Dr. Dina Castro, a recognized expert in early childhood well-being. Dr. Castro is the Bahamdan Endowed Professor in Early Childhood Well-being and Director of the Institute for Early Childhood Well-being at Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, Boston University. She holds appointments in the Teaching and Learning and Language and Literacy departments and in the Pardee School of Global Studies. She's also a visiting professor at the, okay, I'm going to try this out here, Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. And currently she is the principal investigator of a study aimed to improve language and literacy teaching in early childhood classrooms, supporting bilingualism and biliteracy among children in immigrant families. She's also involved in global research and policy work with a focus on the impact of migration on children's social-emotional well-being, intercultural bilingual education, and Afro-diasporic education in early childhood. Welcome, Dina.
You're muted, Dina.
Okay, now, ahora sí. I think, can you hear me now? Well,
Yes.
perfect.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
There
yeah.
you go.
Well, hello, everyone. Also, very honored to be part of this conversation. I think, as Julie was saying, very needed at this moment, and given all that is happening around the world and in the United States with related to our migrant communities. I've been working in this field for many years, and I wanted to just briefly share that my work began in my native Peru in the 80s and 90s when there was an internal conflict, the political conflict that
I'm sorry,
displaced.
Dina, could you speak a little bit louder because it's
Okay. And can you hear me better now? Is better, or
there
I
was
need
some comments in the chat. I don't know, but yes, a ver.
or perhaps I'm using the earphone. So if I stop doing that, let me try. Did this work better? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
I think Now it's louder, no? Yes. Thank
Is
you.
it? Okay, that's good. Well, I was mentioning that I briefly wanted to say that my work began back in my native Peru when there was in the 80s and 90s internal conflict, political conflict that really displaced many of people living in the Andes, in the Andean. So there were migrants in the capital city, in Lima, where I lived and worked. And so that was the beginning of my career. And then within that environment, I became also a target of that violence. I had to leave in the country unexpectedly in a ride to the United States, and where I continue my work with migrant populations, especially those coming from Latin America through the border with Mexico and the US. So with the background, well, let me just briefly talk about, just add a little bit more of the information related to migration that we all know is a global reality and have been exacerbated in the recent decades because of the wars, political violence, domestic violence, especially women migrate escaping domestic violence. Sometimes there are conflicts related to the narco traffic and all of these factors that have exacerbated climate change. Natural disasters are happening around the world, and what persists, the poverty, persistent poverty that forces families to leave their communities and in looking for better economic opportunities. And so about 20% of the world's total international migrant lived in the United States. This is just for us to put context also. And the influx of migrants are coming from what we will say is the global South, so Latin America, African, especially Central and South Asian countries, and the Middle East at this moment, to the global North, which is North America and Europe. And that's bringing a lot of an increased linguistic and cultural diversity in early childhood settings, which, this is the aspect that I've been dedicating my work is in preparing teachers, early educators to work with this population of young children who are coming from these diverse language and linguistic and cultural backgrounds. For women in particular who are migrate, they face a number of challenges that are unique to the fact that they are migrants and they are also in the role of mothers. Here's a piece of information from a recent study, and is saying that, identifying the Latin American asylum seeking families report post-traumatic distress to 161 to 204% higher than non-migrants, with adverse consequences. Definitely, we'll talk about that for their health and well-being for themselves and their children. Just as it was mentioned, where some of the challenges faced by migrant women and with young children include, of course, the separation from their families, the lack of, they lose the support of their networks. They have most of the time language and cultural differences. They come from countries where languages in the US, for example, languages other than the host country are spoken. They face discrimination and racism, and in addition to the financial instability and fear of deportation. Trauma, there are a number of studies that have documented that trauma faced by women in particular and young children who are related to their experiences of migration, pre-migration, during migration, that journey until they arrived in their host country is it can be very traumatic, and particularly in the case of women, they and
girls, they can be victims of sexual exploitation and sexual violence along the way and when they arrived as well. Here is something that I wanted to share about one study that a colleague and I conducted a few years ago with women with migrant women from Mexico, and talking about the motivations about improving their lives, the financial life as well. It was interesting that even though what they said about their situation, right? They say, well, here's in English translation. Here, one lives like in prison. There are more risk for everybody. We are afraid to go out. There were there where we came from, there are not those kinds of fears. There are others though. So in this case, it was economic problems. We all know each other. Here we live in a gold cage, but that's still a prison. So this is just some example, and this in the words of women and the words of the voices of women and how they feel about their situation as forced migrants. However, and it was mentioned also but Julie, is that they cope. They find their coping strategies. So their family, they start building connections and with family in a study that we conducted. I think with a group of women who were migrants. They had migrated no more than 5 years after arriving in the U.S. They mentioned how they start trying to bring other members of their family to their place. So they start creating their own small I don't know how to I will explain this. It's like rebuilding their village in their new place. So with new family members that arrived and people from their neighborhoods that come also, and they become the ones that welcome them and help them as they start a new life in the new place. So together they start building their own communities, right? So there's social networks and friendships within the, as I said, spirituality and religion, it seems to also plays an important role in finding, solace and strength in their religious beliefs and practices. And talking about coping, continue with cognitive and behavioral, they develop these problem-solving strategies. They become, they look for opportunities in ways in which they could address the challenges and overcome their obstacles. This is an incredible group of survivors, and therefore they look for those. They develop this resiliency. There's strong people. It's amazing. So self-care is they not always do that, but sometimes they do. We conducted a study also on around the fact that existing data about birth weight of children of migrant women, and that show, they call it a paradox. They show that migrant women tend to have children who have better birth outcomes. The children are the it's a low birth weight paradox. The children are more healthier than children of immigrant women who have stayed in the country for longer, or a second generation. So more recent migrants. And some of the things that we're seeing here about self-care, it seems that they maintain healthy eating, and they have different cultural, they maintain their cultural ways of taking care of themselves, and as in the process of building their own communities and maintaining communication with their family members back at home. How is this affecting their children's development? So we know that there are factors that like stress and trauma and the lack of resources that can affect children of migrant mothers in their physical health as well as their community, cognitive development and social emotional development. Related to social emotional development, I want to share with you, these are interviews that we conducted with children that were transnational migrants, the concept of being back and forth and crossing the border. And they cross the border, but then at some point they come back to Mexico. And then, usually because of the immigration policies are, threatening them with deportation. So they go back to Mexico, but then when they think that things are better, they decide to come back and cross the border again. And the children are in this process. And that's what when we talked about transnational. And this doesn't happen, it can take months or a year. And when the children are adapting in one place, they're taken back to Mexico. And then when they are re-adapting in Mexico, including the language and going to schools, they're taken back to the US again. So the children are suffering several times in their life the process of separation with their caregivers and people they loved and friends and family members. So I just wanted to share with you, and I will read the translation because these are the words of the children that we interviewed. One of them say, Joel, I and my little son, brother, yes, all of that. The little one the little ones, the girls, no, they didn't come because they were afraid and they were crying. And this is another, the interviewer asked the child, how did you feel when you moved to another country? How did you feel? The child says, like nothing. And the interviewer says, what does nothing mean? What does it mean? And the child, like I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to do anything because I brought my tablet, my iPad. Oh, you took your iPad, and what did that did to you? It made me not remember my mom and dad. So just wanted to share with you, that's the reasons that we need the impact on children, and we usually don't listen to their voices in this process. They are taken and not asked, right? If what they really want to do or how they feel. Okay, so how am I doing with time? Some major areas of concern, then coming back in in general, we're talking about health disparities that are faced, that migrant women and children experience in the lack of access to and quality of health care. It's an important, of course, consideration. A major concern is the access to high quality early education. And because of all the issues related to mental health and trauma, of course, mental health should be at the center also of all interventions to support these children and families. And access to resources is a key issue as well, as we talked about healthcare and childcare, early education, and social services. I wanted to highlight the fact that even when they may have access, this care may not be culturally relevant for them. So I think that's a key issue. Is not only, well, some places provide language interpretation or in services, but that's not enough. we need to talk about the cultural, etc. So what are the cultural aspects related to the way these women think about their health care and their expectations? We have worked with women who are giving birth in a different place, in a different country, and they may have different beliefs about how to take care of themselves and their young children in the process of, while being pregnant and delivering their babies and taking care of their babies. So it could be very traumatic when they are in an environment where those beliefs, cultural beliefs and practices are not incorporated or not respected. So I want to mention the importance, and that's what early care and education needs to be also focused on being culturally relevant. So we talked about intercultural, bilingual, and multicultural education. How do we make that happen? How do we prepare early educators to work with this population of children and make the education linguistically and culturally relevant for these children and families, and taking also supporting them and considering all their migration experiences. So if I have a couple more minutes, I will.
You have 1 more minute, Dina.
1 minute, and then just I will go fast. My colleagues and I have developed a professional development program precisely to prepare early educators to work with this population of young children and support their families. So this is a program that's called the Nuestros Niños program. We created this program. Let me go. Yeah, we created this program about 20 years ago when we were in North Carolina. And it has been implemented so far in North Carolina, California, and Florida. And currently, we're working with early educators from Colorado and Massachusetts in this program. The majority is interesting. Majority of the participants that we have now in Boston, in Massachusetts, and also in Denver are migrant women. And this is important because we are supporting them. Some of them have not completed or just completed high school education, but there are others who have teaching educator reaching degrees, or they're lawyers, or they had other professions, but they cannot work in the United States in their profession. So and they decided to work as early educators also because they have young children of their own, and became more interested in child development. So we're finding this program is a way to also provide a professional pathway for these women once they settle in their new places. So they learned about, they learned about teaching bilingual, bicultural young children, and they obtained through the program, we provide this is a federally funded grant. We provide scholarship for 12 college credits that they could then use either towards a bachelor degrees or master's degree. The program is fully online, and we also provide materials for them, specifically books and multilingual in different languages, so multilingual books for themselves and their families. So I just wanted to share this hope, and this is some of the work that we're doing, and I know there are other initiatives around the country to support these families, and these women and their children. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Dina, for sharing not only the voices of those with lived experience, but also showing how integrating social emotional strategies into caregiving practices really helps to promote healing and stability for displaced communities. So thank you. Our final speaker is Dr. Kate Schwartz, who is a senior research scientist at Global Ties for Children, an adjunct professor within applied statistics, applied psychology, and the Institute for Human Development and Social Change at NYU. Her work centers on research practice partnerships, finding the right methodology for the right question, and fostering child development within under-resourced and conflict-affected settings through supporting the adults in children's lives. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Athea. I appreciate it. So you've heard from my co-panelists about the impacts of displacement and trauma on children and families, and specifically on child development and parental or caregiver well-being, and thus why migrant and refugee families likely need extra support while generally receiving less. And as they both highlighted, this is of particular importance in this global political movement. So I'm going to be presenting a slightly different build off of that, and actually talking about a couple key takeaways from two large initiatives that Global Ties for Children has been doing in humanitarian settings. We've been the research partner on this work for the past 7 years. So that's going to be my focus here. I am also thrilled to be with all of you today and really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. This is extremely partnership-based work, as you can probably see from all the logos here. So I just wanted to thank all of our partners. Again, we're the research partner on this work. We have on-the-ground implementation partners for the programs. A lot of the mass media content I'll be talking about is made by Sesame Workshop. And I'll go through a few of the initiatives really briefly. As a note, we use the word caregivers in all of our work because, as we've pointed out here, these children are not necessarily with parents. So we're talking about whoever is acting in a caregiver capacity in the child's daily life when we're talking about caregivers. I feel like in some contexts that makes people assume you're talking about childcare or someplace where they're going outside of the home. We're actually talking about the primary caregiver in the home. We're just acknowledging that it's not necessarily the parent. So the initiatives here are Alan Simpson, which means Welcome Sesame in Arabic, and Play to Learn. Alan Simpson is funded by the MacArthur Foundation. A prize they were doing $100 million and change, $100 million for the idea most likely to change the world. That Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee went together on and asked us to be the research partners on, and presented a whole series of ideas of things to do for Syrian refugees within the Syrian refugee response region. So originally, this changed a lot during COVID, but originally we were talking about work in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. The projects mostly ended up being in Lebanon and Jordan. And a lot of them actually became remote, which is part of what I'm going to focus on today, because I think understanding what works remotely opens up huge avenues for how to reach migrant and highly mobile families. And so it actually, in some ways, COVID ended up being a blessing because it forced a bunch of our work to go remote. And now we have programs that we're pretty confident could be adapted and applied in settings where you just can't get in-person services there, even absent a pandemic. So I'll go through that a little bit. And then Play to Learn was funded a year later by the Lego Foundation, kind of extending the same type of work in partnership with BRAC and IPA into the Rohingya refugee context in Bangladesh and Venezuelan refugees within Colombia. So those are some of the projects. I don't have time to go into all of these initiatives at length, so I'm happy to discuss in the discussion section. I'll just highlight a few as I'm making key points. But the entire body of work across these two initiatives is 5 impact evaluations, 2 implementation studies, a longitudinal study of Rohingya moms and their young children, and with a focus on adolescent moms, and a whole slew of associated pilot and qualitative studies. We have embedded qualitative work with participants and communities in almost all of our projects. So there's a lot of papers and projects and things going into all of this. But one of the key takeaways, especially if you're talking about early childhood, that I think is a little bit of or at least was a surprising takeaway pre-2020, is that remote programming can work even for young children. I think when we went into this, the idea was whatever we were doing had to be communities that we could get in person, because you can't do early childhood education with 5-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. You can't put them in front of a screen and get the attention span. It's just not going to work. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the ways we've gone around doing that and what we've discovered seems to make that work versus not work. So a really exciting one that this project I specifically led. A lot of the projects here I advised and oversaw and counseled on. So this is a remote early learning program in Lebanon. When COVID hit, the IRC team on the ground didn't want to lose the preschool for healing classrooms programs that they were running. And so they really quickly worked to adapt them to be delivered remotely. And they did it in a very thoughtful way. Instead of focusing on what school looks like and the idea of a child joining a classroom on Zoom, for example, they focused on the elements of early childhood education that are most important for learning, which is play, scaffolded activities, interaction, direct interaction, hands-on experiences. And so in doing that, what they came up with was that teachers are delivering the early childhood education to caregivers over audio calls because video is harder to have service. So audio calls with caregivers, 5 to 6 caregivers in a classroom. And they're 35 to 40-minute calls 3 times a week over 11 weeks. And so these calls, and actually 31 calls, so a couple of weeks are 2 calls, with one-on-one follow-ups with any families that are struggling or missed it. There's a lot of rescheduling that happens. I can go into a lot of the details of how this worked. They were very adaptable and flexible. And then they're texting over WhatsApp the families videos that they can use with their children, read aloud storybooks, songs they can sing, activities they can do, how to make Play-Doh at home, various things like that that then are incorporated into the lessons. And the caregivers are the ones doing the lessons and the activities directly with their children, not the teachers. So you have this caregiver mediated early childhood preschool program that they started doing at the beginning of the pandemic. It was not what we were planning on evaluating in the research. And what they quickly learned is that there was a lot of families saying, this is actually easier than getting my child to a preschool. And this is great. And I feel involved in my kids' education. And so we got to talking and we're like, why don't we evaluate this instead? And so we, after schools were reopening, specifically went into communities of Lebanon that just had never had early childhood education access. There's no preschools, they're really remote. The ones we were in were almost entirely Syrian refugee communities. Our sample was 96 or 97% Syrian refugee families, where there just wasn't an early childhood option. And so it didn't matter whether there was a pandemic or not, there wasn't an option there. And we did this program there and did an impact evaluation of how the program worked there, and found that it had impacts very much in the range of what you see when you compare preschool to no preschool. We're talking about effect sizes around 0.3 on early numeracy, early literacy, motor skills, and social emotional development. And I can go into more specifics on what those look like, but we were shocked at how effective it was. And we also did this very deep embedded qualitative study, and I can send links to both of those studies. They're both, the qualitative study and the impact evaluation, have both been published and are out, and we have briefs on both. But the qualitative work, we had teachers telling us, I never thought this would work. There's no way. We can't, if we're not interacting with the children, we can't do this. It's not going to work the same for all families. The caregivers aren't equipped. And then they started doing it, and we're like, actually, it really works. And they were so proud of themselves. And we also tested, and it worked equally well for families whose caregivers were learning to read with their children as for families whose caregivers had higher education. So it was really exciting. Other ways that we did remote work, and some of this isn't totally remote, but on the left here, we have the mass media impact evaluation in Jordan. This was not done as a remote program, but it was of a television show that we could easily deliver remotely, and that millions of Arabic-speaking children have been watching remotely. And so I thought it was relevant to point out here. But the impact evaluation was done in classrooms, in preschool classrooms in Jordan. The Ministry of Education was partnering with us and said, you know, our curriculum doesn't have emotional skills. It has numeracy, it has literacy, but we're not talking about emotional skills. And we think this is really important, especially for refugee children and for the host communities, the children who are then interacting and hosting the influx. So we used the television show that Sesame Workshop had created called Alan Simpson, and showed it in classrooms, 26 episodes. In treatment schools and control schools just got the curriculum like normal. And we found that there was an increase in using emotional vocabulary and providing a plausible response to vignettes. So you do direct things with children where you're like, these two kids are interacting, here's what's happening, how would you feel? And they say how they would feel. And also and asking what they would do in different situations, and them endorsing that they would do deep breathing or belly breathing, which is a big strategy that is endorsed within the Alan Simpson TV show. We also were working with Sesame Workshop and IPA and Columbia, using these much shorter, not a full television show, but these much shorter watch, play, learn videos that have been created across a bunch, not just, we were using math and emotional skills, but there's science ones, there's reading ones, like they've created a bunch of them. And there are these very short clips on these key skills. And so in that one, families signed up to be WhatsApp. It was delivered fully remotely. And they got sent videos where 5 minutes was emotional skills and 5 minutes of math. The order was randomized. And then control families also got sent Sesame videos, but not related to those two topics. And there we also found an increase in emotional vocabulary, expressive emotion identification. We didn't get the learning strategies there, but it was a much lighter touch intervention. But the effect sizes were actually very similar for both of these, suggesting that media is also a way that we can remotely reach families when it's hard to reach them in person. I will say that in Colombia, there's a number of families that just never opened the links, even though they signed up for it. So we do need to think more about who's being left behind if you're sending a video link. Whereas in Lebanon, when it was a much more engaged program with the teachers and they have a relationship with the teachers, we found extremely high attendance, higher than you often get for in-person programs, actually. And then not every remote approach works for child development in particular. Another study that we did in Jordan was a phone-based Reach Up and Learn project. So Reach Up and Learn comes out of Jamaica and is usually an in-person program. We are adapting it to be done over the phone during COVID. But as you can see on the slide here, it was only 7 minutes of extra content. And the 7 minutes were really, I think, really probably not enough time in those calls. So we did not find anything on child development here, but interestingly, so both groups, the treatment and control, were both getting phone calls. The control was just getting a health check-in, so it's just a checklist of health items, and the treatment was getting an emotional well-being check-in and this additional child development activity content. And what we did find is that we actually had decreased depressive symptoms in the treatment group. And that's a group where the volunteers that we're calling them, the community health volunteers who were given a stipend, but were technically volunteers because you can't work as refugees. But the volunteers that we're calling them were actually trained in responsive listening and like doing this emotional well-being check-in and collaborating back and forth with the caregiver in a way that those doing the health checklist were not. And so we think that training on how the phone calls went was likely what led to the decrease in depressive symptoms within that treatment population, which as my panelists were talking about, that's really, really important for child development and well-being as well, when the caregiver is feeling better and doing better. I did not check the time check when I was going. Asia, how much time do I have left?
You actually have about 2 to 3 more minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. So as I was saying, remote programming can work. A lot of what we found, there's a lot of concerns around sufficient Wi-Fi, data, connectivity that need to be overcome. There are various ways we can talk in the panel if people are interested about how to overcome them, as well as things that we know that families told us they were doing in our qualitative work. I think it's really about the adaptability and the support in doing the program. The RELP caregivers were extremely supported in doing it, and the phone-based RUL did not have the same modeling or extensive support on how to do the activities with their children. And I think relationships and trust are really, really critical. I also think the reason I focused on this takeaway today is that this opens up a range of possible solutions in terms of equity and access, in terms of whoever is least likely to get a slot in the in-person school. So even if there is an in-person school, if boys are being prioritized, if there's not enough slots for refugee or migrant families, this opens up possibilities for really extending high quality early childhood care to populations that might otherwise be being left out. And then cognizant of time, so I'll just say this quickly. I just wanted to point out that a big part of this, though, is to be aware of what the actual community needs. So I call this mind the gap. But you need to understand the community identified needs and wants. And I think that's why many of these worked so well, and where they didn't, that is where it was. So just to give a few examples, I was going to talk through our father engagement program, and I don't think I have time to tell you all the details. But
actually, Kate, that looks really fascinating. So can we just get into it a little bit?
Sure. So with the Rohingya population in Bangladesh, we did this father curriculum. So they've been doing programs to support mothers, and they wanted to do something to support fathers. But instead of BRAC just being like, well, here's what we're going to do, they did this extensive work with the fathers saying, what do you want? What do you need? And they're like, we want to understand how to interact with our children better. We want to understand well-being. We feel stressed. We feel like we don't know how to help our families in this context where we're living in this locked down camp. And so the program was created in like really genuine collaboration with the fathers directly. And interestingly, we then studied it both in the camps and in the host communities nearby Cox's Bazar, and we had much higher impacts in the camps where it was created, because I think the program was specifically tailored to that population in a way that it was not for the host community. But we had a positive impact on both father and mother reports of father's engagement with the child and the family. No reported impact on the father well-being, but the father reported positive increased child social emotional development, which we did not see in direct assessments or mother reports. So to us, what that means is the father was paying a lot more attention to their child's development, which is super interesting. And all of these findings were stronger in the camp community where we created the intervention directly with the fathers. And also just to point out, in general, BRAC's work with the Rohingya has been extremely, like, all the work with the early childhood humanitarian play labs and with the mothers has brought in Rohingya arts and Rohingya culture and dance and chant, and it's just been extremely community focused. And a lot of the focus, rather than necessarily being about numeracy or literacy, they've talked to families and been like, we need huge sections on safety to avoid child trafficking, because that's a big child trafficking region. Specifically for our girls, we need hygiene and safety. We need hygiene as part of our curriculum. So there's just this real co-creation with what the community is saying it needs that I think makes the program infinitely more effective. And that's true for the programs I'd already introduced. So in Jordan, when we were working with the ministry, they're telling us we don't have this as part of our UC curriculum. And that's why that's what we studied. And that's the particular episode that we showed in the classroom. In Colombia, there was a bunch of formative research. Sesame Workshop always does this immense amount of formative research in any project that they do. Interestingly, here there was a misstep. We were under the impression that the families we were going to be serving were not going to have access to formal early childhood education. And it turns out in our study, 87% of them did. And so we didn't have impacts on math. And when we went, what we do after all of our studies, sorry, I'm trying to cover too much information in 15 minutes. What we do after all of our studies is we go to we go have focus groups with the participants, and we tell them our findings and we ask them their results, their thoughts on them. And when we met with the caregivers in Colombia, we specifically asked, we were like, so the math content, and before we could even ask the question, they're singing the songs back to us with the math content. So they obviously knew it, but we found no impacts there. And then they told us, well, yeah, it was great. When our kids got it in school, they already knew it. We were like, oh, the control group got the same contents. So that's one thing where there wasn't a gap, it turned out. And then, of course, there's a huge gap where you're talking about places where there just isn't an in-person school. And how do you provide early child education where there isn't an in-person school? But all of this really highlights the role of context and the need to kind of adapt. And I would add here, that's why I highlighted adaptive family schedules too. The amount of flexibility that our teachers had in RELP was just amazing. And it's true for the father engagement study of the Rohingya as well. Like, they were working around the father's schedules. They were working around the caregiver schedules. They were like, we are going to make this program work for you and for the restrictions and demands that you're facing in your lives, because we know you're facing a lot. And I think that's really critical. And for all of this, it's just, it has to align with the community. Like, I would not say any program we've done should be taken wholesale and put into a new community, but where they aligned with what the community really needed and wanted, I think we found really exciting, effective, and like extremely positive responses to a lot of this work. And that's why I highlight Mind the Gap as its own takeaway. Sorry for going over, but hopefully we can talk more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kate, for really highlighting how migration-related challenges create some of these unique barriers to education and well-being, and really require these targeted solutions. But that has to be in tandem with the communities that you're trying to serve. And thank you for stressing that, because it's so important. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you to all of our incredible speakers for sharing their insights. And we're going to move into Q&A now. So I've seen 2 questions in the chat here, and feel free to add additional ones. I'm going to switch over to the Whova platform and look at those. But this is your opportunity to ask questions directly to our panelists. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to just speak your question. We'll call on you, but also know that you can submit questions in the chat. So if we switch really quickly over to the platform, I want to address a question that was raised actually prior to our session by Beatrice Gonzalez. And the question was, when speaking about migration, should we speak both legal and illegal migration as the same phenomenon? What do you think about that? So if any of our panelists would like to take that one on.
I'll jump in to start to say that in my own work, in my own research and my thinking, my practical work as well as an educator, I think about refugee/immigrants as a continuum and as a collective category. And the reason that I do this is because while there are legal definitions of who is a refugee and who is not a refugee, who is documented and able to enter a country, who is not, I find that there's so much variation within individuals and families and groups that live within those legal boundaries, that the boundaries actually don't hold. And I don't find it helpful as an educator and as a caregiver myself to affix much to those legal definitions. If I were a lawyer, perhaps I would approach this differently, but I'm not. So that's just what I'd like to say on that. A child, as an educator, a child is a child and they're beautiful and they have all the potential in the world and they're there in my classroom and I'm going to give them all of my time and attention. The legality of their status or the nature of their migration status is important in so much as it's part of their story and it's part of my responsibility to know what their journey has been, and what they're bringing to the classroom, both in terms of their resilience and their assets, as well as their needs. But the actual legal status, I don't think ties as closely as we imagine to those journeys. I'll stop there. I don't even know if that made sense. Dina, you were going to jump in.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And I think yes, okay. Can you hear me now? I hope better. Just
Yes.
wanted to add that what we are concerned about is the impact on the human person, right? The human being. Is this the adult parent and the children? And for those of us who have contact with both, I think that's to me, it doesn't matter, the way in which they arrived. However, when I say it doesn't matter, is regardless, I would say it's not that it doesn't matter, regardless of that paperwork, because the traumatic impact could also be there for those who come, let's say, with documents, in terms of the impact of separation, how to deal with the different cultures, languages, when a child is going into a place where they don't understand what people are telling to them. This doesn't have anything to do with the documentation that they have or not. So I just want to highlight that. So we have to be prepared and sensitive to work with these children and their adult caregivers. And really, the documentation they have, it doesn't matter. It's not an issue.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that and just add that in our work, a lot of it is paying attention to what it means in terms of what the constraints are on the family, like if they're able to work, if they're needing to have one caregiver go somewhere else to work. And so what does that mean if we're trying to work with the families who's there? So like, we don't think about it for it mattering as a legality thing, but we do think about, like, RELP so far has been tested with Syrian refugee families where the caregivers weren't allowed to legally work. I'm not saying they aren't working in some ways, but like legally. And so there's a different time constraint there. Although at the same time, a lot of the activities were done by siblings and grandparents. So I don't know what that means, but we think about what it means in terms of like payment and involvement of families. We do a lot of stipending for people involved in our programs so they can, so like the Rohingya Fathers engagement, it was Rohingya fathers visiting other Rohingya fathers, but you can't legally pay them, but you can stipend them. So like there's a lot of like minutia there, but otherwise I fully agree.
Okay, perfect. I am going to jump to a question that is in the Zoom chat from Ashley, and I apologize, Ashley, if I pronounce your last name wrong, Ravishay. And the question is, traditionally, government controls education as a way of normalizing specific cultural and often political positions. How is emotional intelligence curriculum impacted by political views who consider this woke or progressive? There's a lot bundled in that question, but thank you, Ashley. All right. Who would like to take that one on?
Well, I can talk about it in our work, which just tends to be more about emotion identification. Like when we're talking about emotional skills, we're talking about like emotional vocabulary, expressive and receptive emotion identification, recognizing how someone might feel in a situation and strategies to deal with when you're feeling really angry or really frustrated or really sad or so I don't know that it, especially with little kids, that it gets into that it's hitting the political buttons in the same way. I have learned very quickly and personally, and I'm just talking for me here, but like I don't use the phrase social emotional learning when I talk about the programs we've done with Sesame Workshop, because I feel like that becomes a curriculum, and those curriculums get into like different cultural assumptions about what the space is. And I'm like, I don't want to. So I'm always like, we're just talking emotion skills, emotion identification, emotion knowledge, emotion skills. So that's been one purposeful thing I've done, is not get into the whole as all the assumptions people carry with them when you say social emotional learning. But other than that, I feel like it's early childhood enough that it's kind of not touching on that as much.
I'll build on that, Kate, to say that here in Arizona, social emotional learning is not allowed in our schools by our state Department of Education. And so, and of course it happens because social emotional learning contains so much, right? It is a curriculum in some spaces, but it's so much more than a curriculum, and it has all these components. And here in Arizona, we can talk about trauma-informed practice. We can talk about resilience. We can talk about assets. So there's a lot that we can talk about that is also part of social and emotional learning. We just cannot use the phrase social and emotional learning. And I think this is something that we all have to be very mindful of because it's very context dependent. And so it's not only about politics, although in Arizona, it's definitely about politics, but it's not only about politics. And so I think we need to know our communities, back to your point, Kate, of really understanding the language that the community is using. Harvard's ESOL lab that looks at social and emotional learning approaches around the world, if you open any of those, they're using a different set of vocabulary, often intersecting with each other in really powerful ways. And so what is the vocabulary in use? What are the values and approaches that families are taking in a particular community, whether that's politically loaded or culturally embedded or whatever it might be? Our job as practitioners and as caregivers in our communities is to be aware of all of those nuances and sensitivities. So I appreciate your question, Ashley, and it's a timely one because there are certain words that are triggers, that are buttons, and that are that cause danger, both for educators and for parents potentially, right? And so we need to be very aware of all of these things across the board.
Okay, I am going to take another question from the Zoom chat from Masui Suzuki. Hopefully I got your name right. And it is, could you share your thoughts on how empowerment of mothers, fathers, caregivers, and the programs you mentioned in your presentations contribute to prevention of violence against children? So corporal punishment and other forms of violence. Any correlation?
So one thing I didn't go into detail of with the remote early learning program study is we actually did a 3-arm study. So one arm got remote early learning program, one got remote early learning program, and a parenting support program called Allen Simpson Families. And then the control group was a wait list. So they got the programs afterwards, after the study ended. And the Allen Simpson Families did not, we thought it might add to the effectiveness of the early childhood education because you're like supported as caregivers. And it did not. In fact, if anything, the effect sizes were a little smaller in that group. But one thing it did do is there was a notable reduction in reports of spanking. So we didn't have a larger list of corporal punishment questions in our data, and I wish we had. We just had a single question around spanking. We had other around like praise and other forms of reacting disciplinarily, but not physical punishment. But it was a notable reduction in frequency of spanking, and that was actually one of the topics that program took on. And people told us qualitatively, they were like, what I learned in Allen Simpson Families was not to hit my kid. And interestingly, there was actually a reduction in spanking in just the early child education program for both groups, only for boys. only for boy children, caregivers of boy children. So this idea that maybe the program was keeping kids that they might see as like more hyperactive or underfoot. I'm not sure. This is just theorizing. Like it was giving them activities. I don't know because it wasn't part of that program. It wasn't a specific topic. It was a topic in our father engagement program. We didn't have impacts on it, but people did qualitatively talk about it. So I do think it's something you can talk through if you're doing a culturally aware and like cognizant building genuine relationships with people. It's a topic that you can discuss with caregivers very effectively. Like no one was offended in RELP. They were like, oh, this was great. I learned a better way to respond when I'm frustrated with my kid. So what we have is hopeful, but it was not something that was a huge focus of a lot of our work.
Okay, and so because we have promised this time for a large group discussion and community sharing, I want to make sure that we are cognizant of time and are still able to do that. So I would ask the presenters to, as you engage, think about Elizabeth Schumann has a question in here, so we can try to bundle that into the discussion. And can you share some hopeful initiatives that you've come across? So kind of keep that top of mind as we go into this discussion section. And so we'd now just love to hear from you, our audience. This is your chance for open discussion where you can share your experiences and ideas and strategies related to today's topic. We know many of you work in the space with this particular population. And so we just love to hear from you on how you're providing support for women and children in forced migration or transitional contexts. So feel free to raise your hand or use one of the available emojis, and we'll call out on you if there's something that you would you'd like to talk about. All right, I need to switch screens so I can see everyone. All right, am I missing any hands raised at the moment? If we don't have anyone who would like to share, we can go back to our questions. Okay, well, we might have a shy group today. All right, let's go back to, thank you, Kate, for answering, is it Boziger's question in the chat? So we'll go back and give the other participants an opportunity to do that as well. Actually, let's start with the Elizabeth's question on, can you share some hopeful initiatives that you've come across? So if there's anything that you'd like to expand on in the work that you're currently doing or projects that were not able to fit in the 15-minute time frame of your presentation, please feel free to take this opportunity to share.
I'll jump in and share two things. First, I'm so excited to know about Nuestros Niños, Dina, and I think these types of programs, pathways programs that help caregivers enter education systems and come to understand them and then contribute to them are really powerful and exciting to me. I think also some of the work that's been happening in refugee resettlement spaces where parents are being supported to become in-home childcare providers is really hopeful work as well. In these cases, often, as I've seen in my local context and in other states, usually mothers, not always, but often mothers who have young children are trained to become licensed childcare providers, and then they're able to take other children into their home as well. It provides a form of income for the family, and it also provides safety for the children and care for the children, and it allows other parents to go out into the workforce. And so while that program, I think, is still in its development and growing and has has had more success in some areas than others. I think it's a really hopeful example and a hopeful model. I would also point to any programs that focus on making sure that educators, who are also caregivers in their own way, are prepared to work with culturally and linguistically diverse populations. To your point, Dina, about culturally responsive practice, ensuring that every educator everywhere around the world is prepared to work with migrant children and displaced populations, I think is a critical need right now. Displacement is on the rise. Educators everywhere have children who are arriving and then potentially suddenly leaving their classrooms. And most educators, most education preparation programs do not focus on that, do not prepare educators to meet the needs of these children and families. It's a critical need. And so anywhere that I see that happening, I see that as a hopeful moment. And so thank you for the question, Elizabeth.
Yes, and I think I have to say something about them more about the Nuestros Niños. I wanted to mention also that it's like we are working in the program. It's a three-way, I would say, because it's to prepare early educators and provide a pathway for migrant women to have a career in the new place, in our case in the US. We are preparing them because the children need to have a more culturally and linguistically relevant education that will really consider who they are, their characteristics, and their needs. And the families, because we also involve the families in the process. So the families of the children, so the migrant families, the children of those migrant families, and the providers that work with them. So I just wanted to highlight that this is a complete package, and we're trying to address the needs of these three groups in this program. And yeah, we'll be happy to share more information as needed. Thank you.
I think what makes me the most hopeful, not a specific initiative necessarily, but true in all of our work and a lot of other work I'm seeing, is the focus on play. So if you can get play continuing to happen, even in the midst of trauma and displacement and a lot of like really scary things for families and small children, I think it opens up a lot of resilience. I think it opens up a lot of joy. I think it's really nice for the caregivers to see it. It like just distracts them from what's like, I just think there's so much good that can come out of play. And I didn't highlight it as much when I presented our work, but all of our work is very play centered, very play based, including our assessments for actually seeing how children are doing. All of our measurement tools are also play based.
Okay, we've got a hand raise. Sarah Withers, if you want to come off mute.
Hi guys, how are you? Sorry, I'm on like really low battery, so I thought I'd quickly while I can. So everything you said and you guys are saying is just really, really powerful and really, really important. And I share every point that you've made. So as a teacher, myself, and as a parent, my child's not a migrant, but I live in Tower Hamlets in East London, and it's it's a very Bengali area. Most of the children and parents and families in this area are Bengali. So my child's probably one of the only white children in her class. And as a teacher, I've seen a huge, huge, huge influx in the last few years of migrant children coming over that are finding it. Some of them don't even speak a word of English. I'll just lower my hand. And I'm a music teacher. So one of the things that I find really, really helps is music is a universal language, colors are universal languages, and it's really cool. Actually, I've got goosebumps thinking about it. So I use the notes of keyboards, something as simple as that, to help them learn the language when they're in my classroom, to help them engage better like that. And we just laugh, and it's just a fun way to engage, making things fun. And I think the communities, particularly in my area and places like this, can just do such a huge difference in just offering like I've forgotten the lady's name, I'm so sorry, like play-based opportunities, just to be able to bring the parents together as well. Because if the parents aren't speaking the language, then that doesn't just create a divide with the community, but also a divide with the school, with education. Schools can be getting involved, and that's something that I'm trying to push my daughter's school to do at the moment, is get involved. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, I just kind of wanted to mention my own
Well,
yeah.
thank you, Sarah, and congrats on being dedicated to doing this work and finding unique ways to really engage with the children that you're working with. So kudos
Really
to
fun.
you on that.
Thank you.
I know, hello, just briefly, I think Sarah, they make me think about how music is, as you say, the universal language is also a great opportunity for incorporating culture and the different diversity of cultures of the children and their languages as they sing. If they have this provide a space for them to express themselves, from their own cultural perspectives and languages. That's wonderful. Thank you.
That's very true. One of the things actually that I do is when a new child joins the class that is finding it particularly difficult to get involved, one of my favorite types of music to play, to sing, to do is African music. And so I have loads of fun. If there's a new African child that's come over, I mean that I'm in my element. But it's fun for me as a teacher because I get to learn more about them. And so every time somebody does come in that's very multicultural or struggling with language or great with the language, but just doesn't feel like tight knit with the class and, struggling to fit in, that's something that I always do. Very, very big on cultural music. And it's so important for everybody to learn cultural appreciation, and music is just an awesome way to be able to do it with kids. So thank you. Yeah, very, very good point.
All right, we have another hand from Dr. Wright. You're on mute, Dr. Wright. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for your welcome. I just wanted to reemphasize some of the points that people were making. One of the points I wanted to emphasize about play-based education, just integrating play into it. I know that during the pandemic, at our college, we have a center, and there are a number of children there who are from different cultures. So what we did was that we had the opportunity to send home manipulatives, as well as to use and have the parents create manipulatives around their house using everyday items. So counting could be grapes. We may ask the parents, like, buy grapes this week. And once we did that, it got the children very excited because, of course, afterwards they can eat the grapes. They can add the grapes. There's so many things that they could do. And the other point I wanted to also emphasize is the videos. We also had the teachers go around the school or the community and make videos for the children to see, short videos, no more than a minute or two. And that also helped to continue, the classroom type activities, as well as, making charts and helping the parents to make, what we call anchor charts. So I'm very excited about this. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for sharing your experiences and what's been happening in your local community. We are coming to that time, the end of our session. So this has been a really insightful session that I'm sure we could continue for quite some time. But I want to be respectful of everyone's time and be thoughtful of that. As we wrap up, I want to thank you for joining this important conversation. The work that you're doing to support migrant women and marginalized children is extremely important and transformative. So thank you to our panelists, thank you to our attendees for all that you do and continue to do. We hope that today's session offered valuable insights and strategies and a little bit of connection that you can then take back to your own communities. If there are any resources, so as we were going through this session, presenters were adding resources to the chat, so please grab those before you leave. But if there are resources that you'd like to share with the group, please feel free to add links to the chat. I do want to mention that the NGO Committee on Migration, which is one of our collaborative partners for this event, and its subcommittee on children and migration have curated a resource list to support those who work with and for children and their families in various refugee, migration, and displacement contexts around the world. I will add the link in the chat to the resource list. And it's already been uploaded to the Whova platform for those of you who are going through the platform. For those of you who will be attending additional events during NGO CSW 69's forum, please feel free to revisit the session platform to ask additional questions and connect with other attendees who are interested in the topic. Thank you again for attending today's session, and we wish you all the best in continued efforts to advocate for and provide voice to the plight of migrant women and children. And so we have 5 minutes left, and I'd like to give our presenters an opportunity to say any wrap-up comments or thoughts that they have.
I don't know, Julie? Well, I'll jump in. Well, it has been a wonderful opportunity. I've learned a lot from my colleagues or other presenters, and the conversation, the dialogue with those participating. Thank you very much. I hope we keep up with the conversation. This is a very important topic, and I think we need to use every opportunity to restate our commitment with the migrant population, with those who have to are forced to move and from their countries where they are loved, where they feel safe, to look for other opportunities for themselves and their children. I think that is always, as human beings, is our obligation to provide the supports and to also advocate for policies that will support these human beings that are really in need of the support to have and have the right to look for a better life for themselves and their children. Thank you.
I'll quickly build on Dina to say, yes, thank you. This is the moment for all of us to really examine our work and our communities and how we're supporting each other, and particularly those who've been systemically and historically marginalized within our communities, including our migrant families and children. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for being here and being part of the conversation.
Yep, I would just third that and point out that I think all of our work so far has been families affected by conflict. But I think we're with geopolitical things, both around conflict and around climate change. And with increases of climate change, this issue is only going to become more and more important, unfortunately. I would love to be wrong on that, but I think it's really critical.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for all of our attendees. And I realize I am having trouble with the link for the resource list. So if anybody else is from our Committee on Migration has that quickly to add, can I ask your support in doing that? I'm not sure why it doesn't want me to paste it.
Yes, Jane, I think Jane wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jane.
The NGO Committee on Migration weekly update has a link to the resource list at the as you scroll down at the bottom, there are resources. So if anybody goes on ngo-migration.org, that is the link to the NGO Committee on Migration, and then look for the weekly update. And from there you can find it. Sorry, I don't have the direct link in my
That's okay. I
pocket.
think it worked this time.
Oh, good.
Okay. Well, thank you all. That brings us to the end of our session. Again, thank you to our presenters for your time and your expertise. And it was a lovely session. And so we do very much appreciate your input. So we will officially end our session and allow those of you who are continuing on to other sessions to get there on time, and for everyone else to continue your day. So thank you again from OMAP, as well as all of our partners, our collaborative partners in this work, who include CE International, the Committee on Migration, FAUCO, Seroptimus International, the Early Childhood Peace Consortium, NYU Global Ties, and I've forgotten someone.